In the heart of Dhaka, the capital of Bangladesh, stands a large and quiet building that at first glance looks like any traditional government institution. This is the Central Bank of Bangladesh, a building that carries a massive responsibility, managing the country's foreign currency reserves and safeguarding international money flows through the global banking system. Inside, everything appears slow, routine, and filled with paperwork and internal controls. No one could have imagined that this bank, despite its importance, could become the target of one of the most sophisticated cyber attacks in modern history. But somewhere outside this building, something different was happening. In the digital darkness, someone was watching. Not an ordinary thief, but a group capable of reaching the deepest financial system in the world, the SWIFT network. This is the system used by banks around the world to transfer international funds, a system assumed to be fortified, secure, and closed off from any intrusion. But that assumption was about to be tested. The selection of the Bangladesh Bank was not random. In the world of cybercrime, targets are not chosen based on size alone, but on the level of security weakness, and Bangladesh Bank had a critical vulnerability: an outdated security system, limited updates, and direct connectivity to the SWIFT network without strong defensive infrastructure. But the most dangerous factor was something else: human routine. Banking systems are not just machines, they are operated by people. And whenever humans are part of a system, error becomes a constant possibility. On the other side of the digital world, the attackers were studying all of this carefully. They were not rushing. Instead, they monitored data flows, working hours, and the patterns of transaction requests. Then, they began building something like a dark version of the bank inside the system itself. A version capable of sending transfer instructions that appeared completely legitimate. On a night in February 2016, everything at Bangladesh Bank appeared to be operating normally. The night in Dhaka was quiet, and employees in the International Transfers Department were following their usual routines. But at that very moment, something highly unusual was happening inside the system. Transfer orders were beginning to leave the bank's account at the Federal Reserve Bank of New York. But these orders were not legitimate. They were fraudulent, carefully crafted to appear as if they had been issued by the bank's official systems. The attackers exploited weaknesses in the connection between Bangladesh Bank and the SWIFT network. They did not break into the system through a conventional direct attack. Instead, they entered through a side door, poorly protected internal devices. Money transfer instructions began flowing to accounts overseas, small amounts at first, then larger ones, and then one of the biggest transfers of all, $81 million. All of it happened in silence, without a clear alarm, without immediate suspicion. At that moment, the global financial system was about to discover something deeply unsettling. Trust in international financial networks was not as absolute as everyone had believed. In the world of international bank transfers, there is nothing more important than one word: legitimacy. Every financial transfer between banks passes through the SWIFT system, a global financial messaging network that connects thousands of banks around the world. But this system does not move money directly. Instead, it sends messages containing transfer instructions. And that was the weak point. That night, the attackers began sending SWIFT messages that looked completely normal. The messages were not complex enough to raise suspicion. Instead, they were designed to appear as part of the bank's daily routine. Account names, numbers, transfer instructions, everything looked official. But behind these messages was something entirely different. These orders did not come from the bank's real employees. They came from a system that had been infiltrated beforehand and silently taken over. What made the attack dangerous was not just gaining access to the system, but the ability to imitate the bank's own language. Every bank has its own style of processing transfers, its writing patterns, internal codes, and even small, recurring mistakes. And the attackers did not simply imitate the system, they studied it deeply. In the middle of this complex attack, something unexpected happened. One of the transfer orders was directed to a financial institution called Shalika Foundation. But then, a very small writing error occurred. A simple spelling mistake in the recipient's name. The mistake was not intentional, but it was enough to stop one of the largest thefts in history. The intermediary bank that was supposed to receive the transfer noticed that the name did not match any known legitimate institution. This raised suspicion. Part of the transfers was temporarily stopped. If this simple mistake had not happened, the attackers could have transferred nearly $1 billion instead of only $81 million. But in the world of cybersecurity, small details can sometimes make the difference between disaster and partial survival. Even so, no one at the Central Bank of Bangladesh yet knew that something serious was already happening. The following morning, employees at the Central Bank of Bangladesh began their day as usual. No one realized that the system had been breached overnight, but when the operations team began reviewing international transfers, the first unusual sign appeared. Transfers had been sent from the accounts without clear authorization from senior management. At first, some believed it was a technical error or a delay in system updates, but as they looked closer, the picture began to grow darker. Money had already left, and the orders had not been officially issued. That was when the real questions began to emerge. Who made these transfers? How was the internal system bypassed? Had the SWIFT network itself been breached? Or was the problem inside the bank? Concern began to spread through the management, but no one yet understood that this was not merely a technical problem. It was one of the most sophisticated breaches in the modern history of the global banking system. As the Central Bank of Bangladesh began reviewing its operations, the financial team started to realize that what was happening was not just a temporary technical error. Every transfer that is normally reviewed passes through multiple layers of approval, but the problem here was clear. Orders had been sent from the system without going through the usual procedures. At first, some believed it was related to a delay in documentation or a recording malfunction. But as they investigated further, the situation began to change in a disturbing way. The transfers were not small or random. They were organized, sequential, and directed towards specific external accounts. And that was when the truth began to emerge slowly. This was not an error. This was an attack. Only then did the bank begin to realize that something very serious had happened overnight. But there was an even bigger problem. It was already too late. Once the unauthorized transfers were confirmed, the bank launched an urgent effort to stop the money. Immediate communications were sent to intermediary banks. The SWIFT system was contacted. Emergency orders were issued to freeze the transfers. But the global financial system is not like a single stop button. Once money moves through several international banks, stopping it becomes extremely complex. Every intermediary bank must respond quickly. Every system must recognize the danger, and in this case, speed was the bank's greatest enemy. Some transfers had already reached their final destinations. Others were on their way out of the system entirely. It was like trying to stop a train that had already left the station. As investigators traced the path of the transfers, the destination began to become clear. A large portion of the money had reached the Philippines. Here, a new element entered the story. The local banking system was less strict than American or European systems. The money was transferred into multiple accounts, then rapidly distributed through several financial institutions. Then, part of it was moved into casinos. Yes, actual casinos. Because certain financial laws in the Philippines allowed money to flow through casinos without the same level of scrutiny found in traditional banking. And so, The money began to disappear gradually inside a complex financial system that was difficult to trace. At the same time, other countries, such as Sri Lanka, began appearing in the transfer trail, but the full picture was slowly becoming clear. The money had not simply been stolen. It had been broken apart and redistributed through multiple layers of the global financial system, and that made recovering it nearly impossible in real time. When the money reached the Philippines, it did not enter only the traditional banking system. It entered a place that was more complex and less regulated: casinos. In general, casinos are considered a sensitive point in the financial system because they handle massive amounts of cash every day, often with less scrutiny than banks. And this was where the attackers exploited a weakness. The money that left the Central Bank of Bangladesh did not remain in a single account. Instead, it was divided into smaller amounts, then moved through multiple accounts across different institutions. Each layer had one purpose: to hide the money's true origin. Inside the casinos, the funds were converted into gaming winnings. In other words, they appeared to be money that players had won through gambling. Once recorded as winnings, tracing their original source became far more difficult. This process is known in the world of financial crime as money laundering. But what happened here was more complex than usual because the operation moved extremely quickly through two different financial systems at the same time. At first, Bangladesh Bank tried to contain the crisis internally, but as time passed, information began to leak. Correspondent banks started realizing that unusual transfers had moved through the SWIFT network. Then Bangladesh Bank's name began appearing in internal reports at other financial institutions, and that was when the case entered an entirely new phase. It was no longer a local problem. It had become an international case. U.S. regulators became involved because part of the money was connected to the Federal Reserve System. Then, cybersecurity firms entered the investigation, then the media. And in a single moment, a silent breach turned into one of the biggest financial security scandals in the world. The world began asking, how could a system considered the backbone of global financial transactions be breached? As the crisis escalated, the SWIFT network itself came under scrutiny. SWIFT is not a bank. It is a global financial messaging system used by more than 11,000 financial institutions around the world. It is considered the foundation of modern international transfers. But the problem was not with SWIFT itself. It was with the institutions using it. Investigations began to reveal that the attackers had not breached the central system as a whole. Instead, they targeted weak points at the edges, the banks connected to the network. In the case of Bangladesh Bank, there were internal infrastructure weaknesses, weak security controls, and delayed software updates. It was an extremely dangerous combination, because even the strongest system in the world becomes vulnerable when just one endpoint is compromised. Investigations began uncovering even more alarming details. Internal bank systems had been tampered with, fraudulent SWIFT messages had been processed, and transfer orders appeared completely legitimate. But the biggest question remained: who was behind the attack? As the investigation progressed, investigators began putting together the bigger picture. The attack was not random, and it was not the work of individual hackers. It was a highly organized, multi-stage operation carried out at a very professional level. The technical evidence started pointing to a pattern known in international cybercrime: the same tools, the same infiltration methods, the same software structure. And then, a troubling name began to appear in the background. A group linked to highly sophisticated cyber attacks on banks and financial institutions around the world. In unofficial intelligence reports, the operation was associated with North Korea-linked actors, the Lazarus Group, according to some international investigations. However, this has never been definitively proven in court. What was clear, however, was one thing. This was not a traditional theft operation. It was state-linked cyber financing. And the target was not just Bangladesh Bank, but the global financial system itself. After the money trail was discovered, a global effort began to trace it. But the problem was that the funds did not stay in one place. They were quickly split into dozens of accounts, then into hundreds of smaller transactions. A large portion passed through the Philippines and was moved into casinos, where it left the traditional banking system. And at that point, tracing it became almost impossible because the money transitioned from traceable digital funds into cash inside an opaque system. Still, authorities managed to recover a small portion. Some transfers were stopped at the very last moment, but most of the amount, more than $60 million, was effectively lost. The remaining funds entered a complex financial network and were gradually withdrawn with no realistic way of recovery. This incident revealed a critical truth to the world. The global financial system is not equally secure. It is a chain of interconnected vulnerabilities. After the crisis ended, Bangladesh Bank was never the same again, and neither was the SWIFT network. The entire global financial system entered a phase of comprehensive security review. Banks strengthened their protection systems, additional verification protocols were introduced, and greater focus was placed on monitoring unusual transactions. But the real lesson went far deeper than technology. The story was not about hacking a system, it was about hacking trust. Because the global financial system does not rely only on technology. It relies on something simpler and more dangerous, the assumption that every bank trusts every other bank. And once that assumption is broken, a single attacker in a single night can shake an entire financial system.